A Timberwolves legend weighs in on today's Timberwolves star. We'll discuss that on today's Minnesota basketball party.
This is Locked On Sports Minnesota podcast. It's endless Minnesota Timberwolves talk with the diverse voices of your local experts. It's time for the Minnesota basketball party on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to the party. I'm Sam Ekstrom of Locked On Sports Minnesota. It's Wolves Talk every Wednesday. You're in Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. Please subscribe. We are live and on demand, also on audio, the Locked On Wolves podcast feed, where Ben Beacon produces great daily Wolves content. Check out our audio on that feed wherever you get your podcasts. You'll meet our panel in a second. On today's show, we get into a KG Ant story of the negative variety. Anthony Edwards' comments that we touched on last week still making waves in NBA communities. He has angered the patriarch of the Minnesota Timberwolves, Kevin Garnett, with his comments about the older generation. We'll talk about that. How the season could go pear-shaped for the Timberwolves in a non-injury fashion. We'll get into the doomsday path on today's show. We're going to hear about Ron Johnson's experience at the Lynx game last Friday. Yes, it's a Lynx show as well. And we're going to get into the Mount Rushmore of Timberwolves first-round busts. Why are we bringing that up again today? Well, I'll connect it back to Minnesota sports. But we meet our panel first off with today's opening tip.
I'm Ron Johnson, former Gophers wide receiver, and I'm looking forward to Thursday. But I have to talk about the new generation. There are some things that are better left unsaid.
I'm Ben Beacon, host of the daily Locked On Wolves podcast, and I'll talk a little bit about. I think we may be overreacting to the Anthony Edwards comments. That I mean, there's reactions on both sides that are warranted, but let's move on. It's August, I guess, but let's move on.
I'm Jack Borman, co-host of the Locked On Wolves postcast with my man Luke Inman, and I'm excited to go down memory lane a little bit with both the Lynx and the Timberwolves.
Reggie Wilson, sports director at Care 11, and the Lynx, they're bringing that feeling back again.
The Lynx are awesome right now. Also, Reggie Wilson talked with Tim Connolly yesterday at the State Fair. We'll have to pick his brain about that conversation at the fair, which, I mean, I heard a couple days ago, like it was getting flooded and there were trees down and everything. So hopefully everybody's staying safe and enjoying their fair experience. Let's dive right in. Kevin Garnett, the latest to weigh in on Anthony Edwards' comments. Now, if you forgot from a week ago, Anthony Edwards said, I didn't watch back in the day, so I can't comment. But here are my comments. I don't think they had skill, except for MJ back then. And that has enraged Isaiah Thomas, Paul Pierce, and Kevin Garnett, the latest to weigh in on KG Certified. Can't quote exactly a lot of what KG said. It was classic KG speak, but he said a lot of stuff and basically said Anthony Edwards or a lot of guys, I shouldn't say, he didn't say Anthony Edwards. He said a lot of guys in the NBA, most guys couldn't have played 20 years ago. We had a mid-range. We had a post-up game. We moved the basketball. They don't do any of that anymore. So now it's become a battle of the old guys standing up for their generation, Anthony Edwards getting piled on. And I will say this, like, I think Edwards' comments were probably a little rash, and I think he'll probably end up like walking it back and apologizing and saying he meant no disrespect. I also think that the older generation needs to settle down to say that guys couldn't play in the league 20 years ago. I also think that's kind of a rash statement on his part. But Ron Johnson, there's a lot to chew on here. What'd you take away from KG Certified?
Well, I'm kind of this new generation of talk and say everything that's on your mind. We got to stop this. Like George Teague and some of these guys out and out the older guys for having, side chicks and thoughts on the side and, throwing guys' names out there. But I saw this guy in the club once. Dude, he was married at the time. Like, stop talking so much. And so when you think about Anthony Edwards and his comments, I totally understand where he's going. Because if you watch some of the clips of Michael Jordan playing against some of these guys, some of the guys look like they should be accountants and out on the basketball court. But as evolution happens, everything changes. Cars get faster. Cars get better. If you go back to the Model T Ford and you go to like a brand new, something basic though, like a like a Ford or a Lincoln Navigator, and you go back to the Model T Ford, a Lincoln Navigator, you would kind of say is a really nice car, really big car, moves fast, bigger than normal, but moves fast. It's like a car back in the day. A lot of these newer cars, like a Mazda, would be like, oh man, those Model Ts couldn't keep up with us, man. Like, it's technology. There's so much, like, there's guys handling the ball now, working on ball skills because they watch a YouTube video and they understand trainers. Those guys back then didn't have that. Some of those guys had jobs, second jobs to the NBA. That wasn't their main job. They just went out there and played in off season. They had to go get a job. So it's definitely different, the amount of time these guys put into the game compared to back in the day. But to say Michael Jordan was the only skilled guy, that was dumb. And let's just be real. Like, we got to call a spade a spade. It was dumb. It is what it is. He said it. Now he has to live with it. So I'm going to just leave it at that. It was dumb because you have Magic Johnson, Isaiah Thomas, Larry Bird, who was one of the most skilled, shooters we've seen. Reggie Miller could play. There's a lot of guys you can go down. I mean, Allen Iverson probably throws himself in that old group. I don't know if that's where Anthony Edwards is going with that, like if Allen Iverson's in that or not. Kobe would be in that old group too, and that's what I think he's forgetting. He's not in Kobe's era. He's in this new era at 23. So you're not in that era in the 90s with Kobe and Garnett and some of those guys. And Michael Jordan was in the 90s winning championships. So that's where, like, he's probably gonna have to explain, like, I'm in the 80s, man. Like, the 80s it was, but either way, just let it go.
Ben, you think we're overreacting a bit?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit last week. It's Ant being Ant, right? Like, I mean, he literally said, I shouldn't say this. I didn't watch. And then he proceeded to give his opinion. And he's gotten himself into trouble before, different kinds of trouble for, in a lot of ways, not in a lot of ways, in more serious things, right? But Ant, at his age, maturity level, he's saying he just says a lot of stuff. He's had the camera in his face a lot over the last couple of years. And I think for the most part, his team around him, agent, et cetera, manager, have done a pretty good job of putting him in. Like, he's done a few of those different, more casual interviews that have YouTube videos that have been more fun, and that they can kind of control the situation. And I guess I don't know the full context of this comment, but he did kind of go off the rails a little bit, where he just kind of said what popped into his head. And he's got to be a little bit more careful about that. This, again, is small potatoes compared to some of the more serious stuff. But back to what I said last week, I mean, it depends on how we're defining skill. And Ron touched on this a little bit, but I think Paul Pierce, maybe in the conversation with KG, mentioned like post play and stuff. Like, obviously post play was way better in the 80s and 90s because you had to be able to play in the post to get on the floor as a big. And that was there weren't stretch 4s and 5s, right? Like, that was a completely different skill. The handles, like, you could look at guys in the 90s, whether it's Jason Kidd or Isaiah Thomas in the 80s and early 90s, or Jason Williams, like guys who could really, obviously at a different level, but handles wise, like all these different guys. That may have been Allen Iverson's a good example. That may be a little different other than like Kyrie nowadays, but also guys weren't Euro stepping, guys weren't shooting threes like they are now, guys weren't as efficient as they are now. Like, there's a lot of, I mean, Ron mentioned the evolution of the game. Like, it's impossible to compare the two. And we could sit here all day and say, well, this list of things is better now, and this list of things was better then. But I think the way you set it up is perfect, Sam. Like, to say that somebody couldn't play then, it seems kind of crazy. Like, there's maybe a handful of guys on the fringe of the roster now that would struggle to see playing time then, or maybe couldn't adapt to the physicality. But you can't tell me that Anthony Edwards couldn't adapt to the physicality if you just dropped him into 1987 and, figure out a way, because he's a pretty physical player anyway. And to the point where he doesn't get calls because he just goes through guys. I mean, you can't tell me that, I don't know, just pick another, like, really, like Giannis couldn't play in the 80s or 90s or, whatever. Like, that's obviously crazy. But like, I get it. I also get, it's also, like I said before in the open, like, it's August. So, I mean, we have to talk about something. If Ant says this in November, like, I bet it doesn't get nearly as much attention, other than maybe inside the NBA and TNT. Like, besides that, I don't know that this would be getting as much play if he said it, later in the calendar.
Oh, speaking of which, inside the NBA is going to remember this, and they're going to hang on to it, and we're going to have to hear about it 18 times this year, probably. Jack, where are you at?
I could not care any less than I do about Ant's comments, about KG's comments, about Magic Johnson saying he doesn't respond to guys who haven't won a NBA title and then responding to him. It's August. There's still a long way for us to get to NBA basketball, and Yeah, I'm going to continue enjoying watching the WNBA until October, and we have NBA basketball to talk about. Just because I just don't get anything out of Ant saying what he said, out of KG saying what he said, out of Magic Johnson saying what he said. I think we're always supposed to take people at their word, most of the time, but I truly believe that Anthony Edwards is an exception to the rule, because you have to consider the context of what Ant is saying. And like the way that you set it up, Sam, was perfect. And I think based on that context, it is pretty easy to just be like, yeah, let's not take this seriously and let's just keep pushing and enjoy the rest of our summer.
Just making sweeping blanket statements about a whole generation of athletes either way just probably isn't going to be a super accurate statement. It's hard to take it totally seriously. Reggie Wilson.
It's just so interesting with this like sports debate culture, what feeds into it. And this was like perfect fodder for guys like Stephen A. Smith on stage with Magic, like, Irving Magic Johnson, your response. It's just like, oh man, here we go. Like, like it was such low-hanging fruit. And that's really all it takes these days to get the sports debate culture going. And that's exactly what happened. It was definitely recency bias from Ant, playing with the guys that he plays with right now. And I get that. He feels like his generation is as skilled as it's been in basketball, but everybody's gonna feel like their generation was better. So, it's hard unless you're playing 2K to put this current generation up against the last generation and see who wins. Like put this year's Timberwolves team up against, the Michael Jordan Bulls from like 97, 98 and see like who wins, I guess. Like it's a tough conversation to have because you can't match the two. So, I just think I don't know, just having a little bit more like respect on both sides is probably the best way to go. But it is just funny, like, one little thing and you're riling up that older generation, guys like KG, and then even going back to Magic and Zeke, I'm sure. But there have been times, even I think we mentioned this I mentioned this last week, but Kenny Smith was talking about how there were guys who had supreme handles who were extremely skilled at basketball, but that just wasn't the game back then. That wasn't what was required of them back then. So you didn't see a lot of it. So it's kind of hard to compare. So the whole thing is just, it's good fodder for, as Ben said, August, when there's no hoops happening right now and people are just looking for something to talk about.
I'm still waiting for the first old guy to come out and say, you know what? Ant is absolutely right. We couldn't Euro step. We couldn't do step back 27-foot jumpers. These guys are so much better. We couldn't fly like from behind the free throw line and dunk the ball. No one could do that. I'm still waiting for the first person to come out and say that and actually take Edwards' defense. This debate will probably rage on and probably a lot longer than it should, to be honest with you. But after this, I think this group's pretty optimistic about the Wolves this year. Like we've all predicted 52 to 58 wins, somewhere in that range. But I do want to just entertain the doomsday path for a moment. What could derail the Timberwolves this season, aside from a major injury, which obviously would? But what could set them off track? We're going to get into that next on the Minnesota Basketball Party. eBay Motors brings you today's show. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. And a reminder, we've got a great lineup here at Locked On Sports Minnesota, the Ron Johnson Show on Tuesdays. He had Michael Floyd on, the former Viking, the former Minnesota high school star. That was a great interview yesterday. Minnesota Football Party, starting to preview the Giants week 1. That will be live tomorrow here on Locked On Sports Minnesota. All right, Wolves doomsday path. We're pretty positive about this team. We like the outlook, but what could set them off track? What could cause a big regression from last year? We'll start with Reggie Wilson, and then we'll go Ron, Ben, and Jack.
I just think maybe if like the chemistry is not there like it was last year, and some of these games where we saw last year, those third and fourth quarters were huge for the Timberwolves. If somehow they kind of regress in that department and can't necessarily get that going, maybe that's a case. I mean, we looked at the schedule, what was that, last week, and saw how it's not going to be easy for them. So like I could definitely see a potential like stumbling there, but that is, as you say, doomsday, because I think they are pretty primed to do well again. It was interesting you brought up Tim Connolly, and I asked him like, hey, how confident are you in the Wolves' ability to go further this year? And he was like, look, we're pretty confident. It was part of the reason why he kept the band together, if you will. I asked him like, hey, you decided not to get rid of Cat and keep it going with him, and he said that he's looking forward to the next phase of his evolution, kind of seeing some of the success that he's seen for the first time in his career and building off that. And so I think he's excited to see that the team just continues to grow. He was like, I think we're a very exciting brand of basketball. I think people enjoy watching us. So I think that's something that people are going to see when they see more of our team on nationally televised games moving forward. So he's pretty excited about this season, which, he should be. He put the roster together. But I think that's, if it's not injury, I think just maybe like a chemistry thing, or them not being able to close out games like they did last year, that could befell them. But yeah, I just don't know that happens.
Ron.
Yeah, for me, I kind of agree with Reggie on the chemistry. I think if anything's going to derail this team, or if there's anything that's going to hold them back, it's the chemistry. And when I say that, I mean, we know Anthony Edwards is the guy coming off Team USA, but he has now a new mindset of what team basketball looks like. So we've seen the Kobe Bryant mic'd up videos. We've seen the Michael Jordan stuff, calling guys soft or challenging guys or gambling with his own teammates. The Bulls, quote unquote Michael Jordan thing, they were saying some of the stuff in the locker room was toxic, or they were trying to make it look like it was toxic, and it was either Jordan's way or the highway. Not saying Anthony Edwards is that guy, because he's younger and he has more of a friendly, like this generation. If the old guys want to talk about anything, this generation of player has grew up in the AAU circuit, so they're more friends than enemies. Where back in the day, like Barkley said it, those guys all did not hang out. Like they didn't go to dinner. They weren't reaching out to, I mean, Magic and Isaiah were a rarity to like meet at half court and hug and talk. And other than that, it was like, man, I want to kill this dude. And so you don't have that where guys are literally willing to fight outside of it. When you talk about like Charles Oakley and how many guys he said he wanted to fight after games and before games. So the only thing I think of to derail this team is the chemistry. Like if Anthony Edwards comes in and he's like pissed off about the spacing, or how come we don't talk as much as LeBron and Curry talk on defense? Why aren't you doing this in the post, Rudy? Like Anthony Davis could do this. Why aren't you, like that's the only thing I can see really derailing it. Or Cat taking shots he doesn't need to shoot. Like let Anthony Edwards be the dictator of this team. Play your role, get you 25 a night. You can easily get 25 and 15 rebounds if you just play your game and be the second fiddle Anthony Edwards. But if chemistry's not there because like the expectations are too high, pressure's too high, that could derail the season.
Ben.
Yeah, I would say this is a little bit more broad, but the offense not coming around. I mean, the offense improved a little at the end of last season. I think they played a little bit faster. The pace picked up a little bit. That's something Chris Finch has been wanting the last couple of years. And of course, the pace slowed down after they acquired Rudy Gobert. And Chris Finch, when he got the job in Minnesota, was kind of billed as this offensive guru, and I wouldn't argue that he's not, but the offense has been pretty middle of the pack over his tenure, and for a while last year it was in the bottom third of the league. And so now it's funny because they ended up being the league's best three-point shooting team by percentage. The frequency wasn't quite to where it needed to be. They didn't offensive rebound great, and they turned it over too much. The issue was more turnovers than anything else, and it's this weird thing where their offense needs to get easier shots. They need to play faster to get some of those easier shots and increase the efficiency. But because they're the best defensive team in the league and they're such a good half-court team defensively, it's also in their best interest to play slow. So they have to find that right balance of when to push the pace. They were dead last year, I believe, in running after defensive rebounds. And defensive rebounding has been pretty spotty, although it improved over the course of last season, and certainly having Rudy helps. But if they can just run, like pick their spots to run a little bit more. Ant sometimes, this is clearly nitpicking, but Ant sometimes will just slow it down, and then he'll shoot a pull-up three-pointer or whatever, when really they could push the pace, get an easy bucket, and that helps when they have some of these half-court stretches where they struggle to get efficient shots. So I'm not at all suggesting they play like the 2021-22 Timberwolves and just play at a breakneck speed all the time, but they need to pick their spots. They ran a decent amount after steals, after forcing turnovers, but they didn't run enough after opponent misses, and they turned it over a little too much in the half court. They've improved their shooting, basically replacing Kyle Anderson with some combination of TJ Shannon and Rob Dillingham and Joe Ingles. So the shooting should be the same or better as it was this year, and they were the best in the league. So shoot a few more threes, and part of that's a function of playing fast. But all that together would work to give them a top third offense. And if they want to be the top seed in the West and win a title, I think the offense has to get a little bit better. I don't think the defense will be worse. So I think it's really just picking their spots to be a little bit more efficient offensively and turning the ball over a little bit less.
Jack Borman.
Yeah, that Ben's last point about the three-point shooting was something that I was going to touch on here. I think just when you consider the volume that Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels and Karl Anthony Towns too, for that matter, like if you kind of lump those three together and give them a collective percentage, I think if that dropped a little bit, that's something certainly that would crater some of the spacing in the offense and make it a little tougher for everybody to operate. But the one that I had that I don't think anybody has said yet is just like age coming for Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert a little bit, in that, Mike Conley played a ton of games last year and was relatively healthy for the entire season up until that last series against Dallas. And Rudy Gobert was very healthy for the entire season after coming off a season in which he was not very healthy. So I think if their kind of efficiency and effectiveness kind of falls off a cliff a little bit, I think that's probably the quickest way that we could see this team take a major step back, barring any injuries, just considering how important they were to the team this past season. And then the other one that I had was just Rob Dillingham and TJ Shannon kind of struggling to find their footing early on as rookies. I think that, there's going to be a lot on their shoulders in terms of, this team's ceiling unquestionably gets higher if those two guys play well right off the rip. And if they don't, I think it's going to force more guys like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Jalen Clark, and PJ Dozier to play more minutes, presuming PJ Dozier makes this team. And if that happens, and those guys are out there playing with Rudy Gobert, you're just, I think, going to be really struggling with your spacing offensively, unless Rudy Gobert is just doing the Jared Vanderbilt from 2021-22, where he's just setting a screen every 2 seconds in the half court. So, and then the other part of it too is like if Joe Ingles would have to play, considerable amount of minutes too. I mean, who knows? He could be a weak link defensively, especially if he's out there playing without Rudy Gobert. So I think it kind of all starts and ends for me with Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert potentially falling off a little bit with their age.
Mm-hmm. The wild card scenario that I would toss out would be a desperation move that doesn't pan out. And we've seen this happen a couple times in recent years. The year the Suns traded for Kevin Durant, it went horribly for them. They regressed 19 games that season from 64 wins to 45, bringing in Durant. I think he got hurt right away. That didn't work out because they were desperate. They weren't playing as well. They made a move. They gave up Bridges. They gave up Cam Johnson, bunch of first-round picks. Didn't work out for them. Mavericks brought in Kyrie 2 seasons ago. They were awful. I mean, that move harpooned their team that season. People thought that they were done for, and it actually worked out for them last year. But something along those lines as well. If they get desperate in February, if they're not seeing the wins roll in, that damages their chemistry. But hopefully the doomsday path doesn't come to fruition. The Timberwolves destined again probably for a 50-plus win season. We hope. Fingers crossed. When we return, Ron Johnson was at Target Center last Friday for Lynx Aces. We're going to pick his brain about that and maybe get into the Mayo Moore jersey retirement as well. It's women's basketball as well on the Minnesota basketball party. Quick pause. All right, Ron Johnson, let's give you the floor. I want to hear about Lynx Aces on Friday. You were in the building for the second consecutive win against the Aces as the Lynx are kind of establishing themselves as WNBA favorites.
Yeah, so when I walked into the building, we stopped like this. We didn't realize the Twins were playing the same night, and so of course we stopped for a quick second just to look at the Twins. You could see it kind of from where we were at when we got to the parking garage. So we kind of stopped and watched them for a little bit. We get into the stadium, and I think it was 18-10 or something like that. I can't remember, but they were getting blown out or 8-13, but whatever it was, they went on like a 10-0 run by the time we were in there. And so once we sat down, they called a timeout, they were down, and then as the game progressed, they went up. And in that 10-0 run, I saw absolute dominance by Nafisa Collier. Fee is just absolutely because I love Asia Wilson, I love Kelsey Plum, but watching Fee, you really just got a chance to see a person that plays all ends of the floor, can play everywhere on the floor. The Lynx are a really good team. And the one thing I really like about them is they pick and choose who's going to shoot. It didn't feel like, even though Fee's the star, it didn't feel like it had to go through her all the time. You saw girls moving the ball around. You saw a lot of chemistry. You saw you saw them not getting baited into the Aces, because the Aces do a lot of little stuff you can see on camera probably when they replay it, but there's a lot of elbowing, there's a lot of pushing off to the side, there's a lot like Kelsey Plum. She's old school. She likes to grab the jersey a little bit when she's playing defense and kind of hold and force the girl either to like elbow her off so she can flop back. But there's a lot of things that the Aces try to do that the Lynx didn't fall for it. And slowly but surely they started just pulling away. It got close for a minute, and then they finally pulled away at the end, and then it never got close again. But the Lynx, like even when they subbed in girls, you felt like they were subbing them in because they were up, but then you realize like, no, this is not a blowout yet. It's only 12 points. And so they're deep. Like they have a lot of girls that can come off the bench and still give them crucial minutes, where a lot of teams don't have that luxury. And so just watching Nafisa Collier though, that for me, she's legit. Like I am gonna start, because I was a big Asia Wilson, Kelsey Plum, also like Skylar Diggins. But I was kind of watching those two, but now Nafisa Collier, like I'm gonna have to check her out more because she looked good.
Yeah, she's unbelievable. Jack, you follow this team closely. I've been lobbying hard that the Lynx are the best value on the board to win the WNBA title. Last week, before they beat the Aces in Fever, they were plus 700. Now they're plus 500. People are catching on. But the Aces and the Liberty still getting all the money. I love the Lynx. I mean, they're playing great basketball right now out of the All-Star break, and they kind of do a little bit of everything. I'm a huge fan of this team.
Yeah, they do. If you're a fan of the beautiful game, you certainly will love the Minnesota Lynx. I think it's very difficult to find a team that is as unselfish and connected as they are on both ends of the floor. And it seems like every single time adversity hits and the boat starts rocking, everybody just bands together and they never, ever roll over. And it's so much fun to watch a team that has that quality about them. And I think the other thing for the Lynx as well is they've been a dynamite 3-point shooting team. I mean, when you look at Chechi Zandalicini, Alana Smith, Bridget Carlton, Kayla McBride, all four of those players are shooting better than 42% from three. In the Lynx offense, a big reason as a result, their spacing has been awesome. They have the highest assist percentage in the league. So nearly 80% of their baskets are assisted, which is incredible. And I think a lot of those other 20 comes to just, hey, Nafisa Collier, go get us a bucket. And so it's been really, really fun to watch. And then defensively too, they don't have any, world beaters defensively. Nafisa Collier certainly is one of the best defensive players in the league. But Alana Smith is a little bit of an undersized center. And then, when you think about Courtney Williams at the point of attack defensively, she's not necessarily known for her defense. And I think the way that this team all just kind of buys in collectively and, doesn't let one player get picked on, because they all have each other's back and help each other out really, really nicely. So it's a joy to watch. I think if anybody likes watching high stakes basketball, regardless of who's playing it, and you're a Wolves fan, I certainly think that you'd really come to appreciate watching this Lynx team, because like you said, Sam, I think there's a very good chance that this team can make it deep into the playoffs and win a title, because I think they've played the Liberty and the Aces now a collective, I think 7 times. And I think they're 4-3 or 5-2 against those those two teams right now. And I think the only other time they played the Sun, they got absolutely screwed at the end of regulation in a game that they should have won. Who's the other team that's right up there? So I certainly think that they can beat anybody, and I would not be surprised whatsoever if they won a title.
Yeah, and Reggie, you're covering this team closely over at CARE. I'm sure you had somebody in the building for the Maya Moore jersey retirement on Saturday night. That was a very big deal after the Caitlin Clark Fever game that the Lynx also won to continue their winning streak. But Reg, I'm curious, from your personal perspective, you weren't here for the Maya Moore era, but I'm sure you observed more from afar wherever you were living or working at the time. What are your impressions of Maya just in general?
Man, Maya's like the GOAT for me, man. She was, if she continued to play, you're probably talking about the greatest women's basketball player that we've ever seen. And there might be an argument that could be made that she still is, even with an abbreviated career. And she was like Michael Jordan to me. Michael Jordan on the women's side. She could get a bucket however, whenever. When you had her on the team, when you had her scoring buckets, you just knew that you had a chance to win it all. And it's just so crazy looking back at some of those Olympic teams where you had 4 members of the Lynx on those teams. It's just insane that all 4 of them, 5 of them were playing for one team. And so I hate that I missed that time. It seemed like it was a really cool time to be here in Minnesota watching those Lynx teams. They seemed electric. And, I got here for the very end of Sylvia Fowles, and I didn't get a chance to see Simone Augustus, didn't get a chance to see Maya Moore or Lindsay Whalen. It was really tough, coming here when I did. But what's really cool is, I brought up the Lynx are kind of bringing that feeling back. And, when I first got here, Fee was coming back from, having her baby girl, and it was, a lot of unknowns. It was the very end of Sylvia. And, I kept hearing Cheryl just pump up Fee. And, I hadn't really seen a whole lot of her game. And man, she has more than, made up for what Cheryl was talking about. I don't think Cheryl pumped her up enough considering what we see from her night in and night out. And it's so interesting because at first it seemed like Asia Wilson was running away with the MVP conversation. But now Fee has legitimately kind of put that in question a little bit because of a lot of the strong play that she's had since the Olympic break. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. And I think with Fee kind of leading the troops, scoring 25, 30 points a night, as Jack said, they do have a really good chance of competing for a championship. And I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
Jack, the Maya Moore resume, and let me remind folks, the Lynx had 12 seasons as a franchise before Maya Moore. And they had 2 winning seasons, and they were barely winning seasons, by the way. I mean, they marginally were above 500. Maya Moore comes around, wins 4 titles in 8 years. That's a serious legacy.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think when you consider that she was Rookie of the Year and an All-Star in her first year, and they won the title her first year, that set the tone for what it was going to be. And I mean, you go down her resume, and it's it's wildly impressive in that, she was rookie of the year in 2011, all W second team in 2012, and then was all W first team for the final 6 years of her career. And she was an all-star in 5 of those 6 years. In the final 3 years she was in the all-star game, she won the all-star game MVP. She was finals MVP, a league MVP. But what I think is also really important that shouldn't get lost with Maya Moore was that, when she played for the Lynx and she was with, the starting 5 that Reggie talked about, that's arguably the greatest starting 5 in the history of women's basketball in the WNBA. They're also really pivotal in terms of, becoming a major catalyst for the social justice advocacy that we see in the league today. Back in 2016, they held a press conference before a game that addressed the deaths of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, and wore black warm-up shirts that said "Change starts with us," talking about justice and accountability, which was really cool. And, really kind of kickstarted Maya Moore's second act as a social justice advocate and working for people who had been, wrongfully imprisoned, which was really cool. And then the other part of what was really cool about Maya Moore's jersey retirement the other night is that, it's really rare, I think, that you get to see somebody who looks up to you and is inspired by you as a kid be able to have the same impact on the next generation as you had on the generation that came after you. And to see that there were so many fans there to see Caitlin Clark also get to learn about who inspired Caitlin Clark to become Caitlin Clark is certainly something that's really, really cool. And I think, for Maya to, kind of recognize that before the game and just say how humbled she was, that it was really, really cool to think about how one of those little girls that looked up to her became Caitlin Clark was really cool. And just kind of reaffirmed, you go to a WNBA game. I'm sure Ron saw it the other night. It's like after players are done warming up and they come off the floor, every single little girl that wants a picture, an autograph, they're so gracious with their time because they understand, what that little interaction can do for people. And Maya Moore was certainly somebody who understood that. And to see, so many players in the league now today talk about what Maya Moore did for them. I mean, even Nafisa Collier was born in Jefferson City, grew up in Jefferson City, Missouri, then went to UConn, and then played for the Minnesota Lynx. And that's exactly the same path that Maya Moore took. She grew up in Jefferson City, Missouri, went to UConn and started for the Lynx. So there's just so many cool connections with Maya Moore. And, she was kind of all we had during a time, we'll get into it here, Sam, of it was very much a desert of basketball success on the men's side. So to have someone like Maya Moore on the women's side was a lot of fun.
Yeah, incredible career. Congrats to her. Jersey number hanging in the rafters for the Lynx. We'll be talking more Lynx on this show as the fall goes on. I said fall. Uh-oh. I guess we're into the fall now, guys. That's not good. Labor Day's like less than a week away. In our final segment, we're going to have a little fun at the Timberwolves' expense. Got to do that once in a while. You got to laugh at yourself. This was inspired by the panic yesterday. The Vikings cut a first-round pick. They cut Lewis Seen after 2 seasons. And, it's not great when you see a first-round pick go by the wayside. And Lewis Seen had a tough go. He had injuries, defensive coordinator change. It didn't work out for him for a number of reasons. But I also want to tell the Vikings fans, calm down. Because if you don't know, the Timberwolves have had a pretty rough go of this as well with their draft history. So I'm challenging us to put together a Mount Rushmore of Timberwolves first-round picks that have not worked out. And Jack texted me last night. He said, this is going to take all day. I mean, this is going to take an hour to go through this list. But let's try to expedite it. Give me your best names to go on this Mount Rushmore. And Ben, we haven't heard from you in a bit. I'll give you the first crack at nomination.
Perfect. So and we didn't talk ahead of time about like additional criteria. My take on this is I think it's dangerous to play the game of like they took Wes Johnson over DeMarcus Cousins. Like we could still argue for Wes Johnson, but like we could do that all day with like every draft in history. So I think that becomes tricky. So mine, I think context matters. So like the names that to me are on the list, like Indy Eby is high up there. And I know he was a late first round pick, but that was the only pick the Wolves had in like 6 years. I mean, scrolling through it because of the Joe Smith deal. So they had one first round pick between 2000 and 2004. In 5 years they had one first round pick, and it was 26th, but they took a high school kid, and of course the expectations of, the last time they took a high school kid, it was Kevin Garnett. And so the expectations combined with one pick in 5 years, I think he's got to be in the conversation. I have Jarrett Culver on there. That was that's up there. I think he's got to be on the Mount Rushmore. I have the Randy Foye, Brandon Roy trade, because that was going into year 2 of Dwayne Casey, and they drafted, they could have had Brandon Roy. He was the rookie of the year. The next year, Kevin Garnett's traded the following offseason. So a year later. And if they have rookie of the year, Brandon Roy, does Dwayne Casey get fired? Does Kevin Garnett get traded? Maybe, but then at least you still have Brandon Roy plus Al Jefferson or whoever they would have gotten in a KG trade. So I think that matters. Even though Randy Foye was a good NBA player, decent to good NBA player, Brandon Roy was the rookie of the year, and they had him and traded him. And then the other one I'll mention is, this one's a little bit, it was tougher for me to decide on a fourth one. Chris Dunn over Jamal Murray. And obviously Chris Dunn is still a good NBA player, but to me in the moment, before the draft, I thought Jamal Murray was a perfect target for the Wolves. And of course they went with the defensive minded point guard for Tibbs anyway. And Jamal Murray was immediately a better, healthier. And I know Dunn ended up getting traded and the whole thing, but to me, that was an obvious pick, and they overthought it, or I guess they Tibbsed it and just took the guy who was going to be the better defender. But to me, that one, because of the time and the context, I think that matters too.
That's a good list. I'll go reverse circle here. Ron, who would you nominate in addition to, name we didn't hear? I don't think you said Johnny Flynn, which surprises me.
I figured someone was going to bring it up anyway. So I tried to think around that one.
Maybe it's Ron Johnson. Ron, what do you got?
So I should have did a little bit more research, because I remember when the Timberwolves drafted OJ Mayo, but did they trade him for Kevin Love, or how did that work?
Yes. Yeah. And it is tough to find a good list that tells you exactly who they came away with. Some of the lists just tell you who they drafted, but it was for a different team, right? So so Mayo.
Mine always is going to go back to not getting Steph Curry. Having the opportunity to get Steph Curry and not getting him. I think that was the Johnny Flynn, Ricky Rubio year. Ricky Rubio, I get it, but Johnny Flynn, I would have went Rubio, Steph Curry. That's just for me. That's always going to be there. But the one thing I do want to point this out. So for Minnesota fans, you guys for years have always hated on the way the Timberwolves have drafted, and a friend of mine was just doing this, saying the Pistons are absolutely cursed. Here's who they could have had, just to give you an idea. Instead of getting Donovan Mitchell with the 13th pick, they got Luke Kennard with the 12th. Instead of getting Devin Booker, they got Stanley Johnson. Instead of getting Giannis Antetokounmpo, they got Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. Instead of getting Klay Thompson, they got Brandon Knight. Instead of getting Paul George, they got Greg Monroe. Instead of getting Dwayne Wade, Carmelo Anthony, or Chris Bosh, they got Darko Milicic. So you want to talk about Mount Rushmores? The Pistons are definitely I felt when it was so funny that you guys did this, and then I got the same message from them last night, and I was like, oh my God, I'm we're talking about the same thing. The Pistons are worse. The Pistons literally was one pick different, and they picked the same type of player but picked the wrong player. So at least the Timberwolves somewhat thought they were, the Kevin Love trade with OJ Mayo and so on and so forth, and some of the other stuff they did. There's always some weird ones in there, but the Pistons are diseased. That is horrible. That is absolutely horrible.
Yeah, the sad thing is that to have regret at that level of the Pistons or the Timberwolves, it just means that you've had a lot of high draft picks, which means you've had a lot of bad seasons, so you're already depressed. And then you get top 10 picks and you squander them that way, the way that those franchises have. It's disheartening, to say the least.
And I will say this, though. They did say if the Pistons had drafted Melo or Bosh, think about the number of championships they probably win with Ben Wallace, Rasheed Wallace, and Rip, and what's his name, the lefty, Tayshaun Prince. Imagine adding that fifth person like a Bosh or Melo instead of Darko. You probably win a couple championships and not just one. So that's the one thing. And then the same thing, talking about Devin Booker being from Detroit and not getting him, talking about being able to go get Paul George, having another scorer to go with that group. They could have had some runs, and they screwed it up.
Yeah.
It's the curse of Isaiah Thomas.
They got a title though. I mean, they do have one
They
title.
do have a title, and the Timberwolves do not. So
They do not.
say that.
We're saving Jack for the anchor leg because I know he thought about this all night. Reggie, again, this is before you got to the market, so it's all part of the lore. Like, what do you hear most about Reggie in terms of like Timberwolves regrets? What has kind of seared itself into your brain?
Oh, I mean, of course, without a doubt, is not getting Steph Curry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, getting Rubio and Johnny Flynn. You know, Rubio was a fine basketball player. Johnny Flynn, you had 2 chances, 2 shots to get Steph, and you don't. And that kind of haunts you. But a couple other things like the 2011 draft. And here's the thing about, you know, revisionist theory or whatever you want to call it, but just going back and looking at these things, it's like you just don't know. You just don't know how these guys are going to turn out. But, you know, you look at the 2010 draft, you draft Wesley Johnson and Paul George was still on the board. The 2011 draft, you draft Derek Williams and Klay Thompson was there. I mean, you don't know that Klay's going to turn into what he turns into probably, but, you know, I don't know that you knew that Derek Williams was going to be, you know, a franchise changing type of player, which he wasn't. You go to 2013, they drafted Trey Burke. Giannis was there, but that was a weird draft. Like, I don't know that you really thought that Giannis was going to turn into what he turned into. So you kind of give him a pass on that one. But, you know, Ben brought up the Chris Dunn and Jamal Murray was there. You know, but yeah, not getting Steph Curry after seeing what Steph Curry just did in the Olympics as well, and his full body of work, just changing the game as we know it as a 3-point shooter. Unforgivable, man.
Can I jump in real quick on Steph Curry? I'm sure Jack's going to talk about this, but my thing with Steph Curry, a little bit of devil's advocate. Like, I didn't mention it because I knew it was super obvious. Everybody talks about it all the time. I've got friends that aren't Timberwolves fans that will just send me memes just randomly about that draft. I think the Steph Curry thing, he's such a generational talent. I'm not saying he wouldn't have been Steph Curry with the Wolves, but the dysfunction around the Wolves at that time, would he have become the same version of Steph Curry with the Timberwolves? We don't know that. But like some of my examples, like they messed up drafts when they had a pretty good infrastructure with Kevin McHale and Flip Saunders and Kevin Garnett when they were already a playoff team, and it could have taken them to the next level with the Hall of Famer and Kevin Garnett. Whereas you draft Steph Curry to the dysfunction of the 2009 Timberwolves and David Kahn and Kurt Rambis. Like, what happens to Steph Curry? What happens to his ankles? Remember all the ankle problems he had? He got a $40 million contract for his first extension because of all the ankle issues. Does the Wolves medical staff figure that out? You know, maybe they do. I don't know. But there's a whole other layer where, like, yes, he still probably becomes a Hall of Famer, but we don't know. Like, what's the rest of this team look like? Is he so disgruntled with how much of a mess they are that David Kahn trades him in year 2? Like, it's just this butterfly effect of like in a vacuum. Yeah, that does belong in the Mount Rushmore. It has to, but is it as clean as that? I don't think it is.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair to say, and really about all of these draft picks, right? You could say, well, in Minnesota, they wouldn't have been the player that they ended up being. The one that I don't get worked up about at all is Derek Williams. It was such a clear-cut 1-2 with Kyrie Irving and Derek Williams. That was not a good draft. There was nobody really worth taking until Kemba at 9 and then Klay at 11. It's not as if that they were in the conversation whatsoever at 2. So I don't get worked up about that one at all. The other top 10 failures, I do a little bit more. But Jack Borman, I'll give you the anchor leg on this.
Yeah, I struggled to come up with a fourth one, largely because of that context, Sam. I think the first 3 that I had, I actually had Jarrett Culver number 1 on this. I just think the process was so bad. I mean, Gerson Rosas has a pretty good track record of, basketball personnel decision-making. Anything outside of that is up for interpretation, but I mean, he made a huge swing to get up to 6 and everybody knew that he wanted Darius Garland, and he just was hoping that Cleveland wouldn't take Darius Garland because they already had Colin Sexton, and didn't, and so then had to scramble, and of course just took Culver when you had Kobe White, Cam Reddish, Cam Johnson, Tyler Hero all went within 7-8 picks after that. I think was was just brutal process. And then the other one that I think hasn't been talked about enough was Wes Johnson going 4 in 2010. They were all the reports at the time were that they were between Wesley Johnson and Paul George, and that they saw, and everyone was in on Paul George, and then Wesley Johnson came and worked out, and that apparently, swung it at the time. So I think when you consider also the fact that, Gordon Hayward was there, plays another similar position. So one of those three guys, you took the wrong guy. You didn't score more than 10 points per game one time in his career. He lasted 2 seasons in Minnesota after scoring less than 8 points a game on under 40% shooting in 144 games. So
wasn't there some discussion about trading down and getting Paul George that year still? Like the Pacers got him at like 10, right?
Yeah.
I think there was like a Flynn for number 10 or something like that, or acquiring a second pick, I feel like was part of I remember those rumors around that time.
Yeah, I mean, you could just put David Kahn's face on this 4 times if you wanted to. I mean, that's something that I would certainly consider. And then again, I just think with Johnny Flynn, it's just the process, right? It's like you take Ricky Rubio, you aren't sure, I guess, how long it's going to take him to come over, which is like horrible in and of itself. If you're going to take a guy with the 5th pick, like you should have a damn good idea of when this guy is going to come over, or mandate like, hey, we'll take you at 5 and you get all this extra money, but like you're coming over this year or next year, and you can have a clearly defined plan so you know how to account for that. And the fact that they just were like, oh, we don't know, whatever, let's just take Johnny Flynn at the same position. And even when Rubio comes over, like there's no positional synergy between those guys whatsoever. And there was just no way that those guys were going to play well and fit well together on the floor. And so I think for me, it's just the process, because I think it's so easy to say in hindsight, like, oh, Derek, like the Derek Williams thing, I think Sam is a great point. It's like, no one knew that some of these guys were going to become some of these guys, but I just think you can absolutely belabor the process with those 3 guys. And I think those are kind of 3. And then maybe you just put David Kahn's face up there as the 4th spot.
Yeah. And the one that I'll close with that no one really touched on is you made a great pick with Zach LaVine. I mean, a really, truly a great 1st round pick, and you give him up, as well as the rights to Lauri Markkanen, who has blossomed for the Jimmy Butler trade. Kind of 2 first-round picks down the drain right there for a guy that kind of ruined your franchise for about 3 years.
And then drafted Justin Patton with the pick you got back, who, of course, injuries were his thing. But
yeah, nice move. Lots of sordid details there in the Timberwolves draft history. It's the Minnesota Basketball Party. Wolves talk every Wednesday. Please subscribe to Locked On Sports Minnesota. We appreciate you watching and listening on the Locked On Wolves podcast feed. Thanks to the everydayers who always tune in here at Locked On Sports Minnesota. For Ron Johnson, Ben Beacon, Jack Borman, Reggie Wilson, I'm Sam Ekstrom. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next week.